All right, we're going to dive into this incredible 40-year journey through modern American history. What we're going to see is how the crisis of one decade really set the table for the triumphs, the tragedies, and the huge transformations of the next. It's the story of how we got to the world we're living in right now. Let's get into it.
Okay, just take a look at these two pictures. On the one side, you've got all the hope and, the idealism of Woodstock in '69. And on the other, the absolute shock and heartbreak of September 11th, 2001. So the big question is, how on earth did we go from that to this? Well, that's the story we're going to unpack.
Our story really kicks off in the 1970s. And honestly, the best way to think about it is like a massive national hangover from the big party that was the 1960s. This was a time when people's faith in the government, in the economy, even in America's role in the world was just shattered.
And it all started with what seemed like a simple, third-rate burglary at the Watergate Hotel. But oh man, what unraveled from there? It was this huge criminal conspiracy operating right out of the White House itself, all designed to take down political opponents. And this scandal went all the way to the top, to President Nixon. It just completely destroyed America's trust in its leaders. And just when you thought public trust couldn't get any lower, boom, a war kicks off in the Middle East, and the OPEC nations decide to cut off the oil supply to the U.S. Now you got to remember, America was using something like 30% of the entire world's energy at the time. So overnight, there were these huge shortages. And those images of cars lined up for blocks, that became the symbol of a new American vulnerability. On top of all that, the economy was a total mess. Americans were dealing with this really weird and painful new problem called stagflation. Just try to wrap your head around this. Prices for everything, gas, food, you name it, are skyrocketing. But at the exact same time, more and more people are losing their jobs. It just didn't make sense. It was this demoralizing trap, and it left millions of people feeling completely insecure about their future.
And really, all the troubles of the 70s seemed to come to a head in this one moment. After the Islamic Revolution in Iran, radical students stormed the U.S. Embassy and took dozens of Americans hostage. And for 444 agonizing days, this was the top story. Every single night. It was just this constant daily reminder of America's perceived weakness on the world stage.
And this was the turning point. I mean, the whole country had been through a failed rescue mission, months and months of just pure frustration. People were done. And then, in this almost unbelievably symbolic moment, the hostages are finally let go, literally minutes after Ronald Reagan takes the oath of office. The message couldn't have been clearer. America was absolutely desperate for a new direction.
So what was that new direction? Well, it was the 1980s. This decade was a complete 180, a really forceful reaction against all that doubt from the 70s. The whole vibe was about a bold promise of renewal. Patriotism was back, the military was getting a huge boost, and a whole new economic philosophy was taking over.
So to fight back against that feeling of weakness from the 70s, Reagan's big idea was peace through strength. And what did that mean in practice? A massive increase in military spending. The logic was pretty straightforward. If the U.S. military is so powerful that no one can challenge it, then that strength itself will prevent conflict. The main target, of course, was the Soviet Union. He even put forward this idea for a space-based missile shield, which everyone immediately nicknamed Star Wars.
Okay, so how do you fix something like stagflation? Well, the answer in the 80s was something called Reaganomics. You've probably heard of it. It's also known as supply-side or trickle-down economics. Here's the core idea. You cut taxes and slash regulations, especially for big businesses and wealthy individuals. The theory is that they'll take that extra money and invest it, build new factories, and that growth will eventually trickle down to everyone else in the form of jobs.
At the same time, the whole country was literally on the move. You had the old industrial powerhouse in the Midwest, the Rust Belt, which was really struggling as factories closed. But then you have this boom happening in the South and Southwest, the Sun Belt. Things like air conditioning suddenly made those hot climates way more livable, and new industries like tech were popping up. So millions of Americans packed up and moved. And this wasn't just a population shift. It completely redrew the political and economic map of the country for generations.
But it wasn't all sunshine and renewed confidence. There were some pretty dark shadows, too. The biggest one was the Iran-Contra affair. This was a huge scandal. It involved a secret and, frankly, illegal deal to sell weapons to Iran, yes, that Iran, and then use the money to fund anti-communist rebels down in Nicaragua. It was super complicated,
And it really brought back a lot of those old questions about whether you could actually trust the government.
Okay, let's jump ahead to the 1990s. Suddenly, the Cold War is over, the Soviet Union is gone, and America finds itself in this strange new world, full of amazing opportunities, but also brand new threats that no one had really thought about before. Everything was changing, and it was changing fast, driven by a new type of conflict and a technology that was about to change everything.
And it didn't take long for this new world order to get its first big test. Saddam Hussein's Iraq invades its tiny oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait. The U.S. responds by putting together this huge international coalition. And the war that followed, Operation Desert Storm, was just a mind-blowing display of American military power. The ground war to free Kuwait, it was over in just 100 hours. Incredible.
But here's the interesting thing. Back home, that huge military win didn't really help President Bush politically. The economy was kind of stuck in the mud, and a lot of people felt he was a bit out of touch. And then this billionaire, Ross Perot, jumps into the race as an independent and just shakes everything up. He pulls a lot of votes away from Bush, which basically clears the path for this young governor from Arkansas, Bill Clinton, to win. It really felt like a changing of the guard.
But honestly, the biggest change in the 90s wasn't in Washington. It was technological. Just look at these numbers. In 1996, only 9% of Americans are online. By 2007, it's 76%. That is an insane rate of growth. The internet went from being this thing for geeks and academics to a part of everyday life. And it happened in the blink of an eye. This was the start of a revolution that was going to change, well, everything.
And that brings us to the 2000s, a brand new millennium. And it starts off with the country incredibly divided politically. And then that division is completely overshadowed by a single event that just shatters everything. It was a decade that forced America to rethink everything, its security, its values, its place in the world, all over again.
So the decade kicks off with maybe the most controversial election in American history. You've got George W. Bush versus Al Gore, and the whole thing comes down to a handful of votes in Florida. It actually ends up being decided by the Supreme Court. I mean, you can't get much more divided than that. The country was split right down the middle as the new president was sworn in.
And just 8 months into that new divided presidency came the day that changed it all.
September 11th, 2001. Al-Qaeda terrorists hijack 4 passenger planes. 2 of them fly directly into the World Trade Center towers. A third slams into the Pentagon. The 4th crashes in a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. In just a couple of hours, nearly 3,000 people were gone, and with them, America's entire sense of security.
The response was immediate and it was massive. President Bush declared a global war on terror. The U.S. military invaded Afghanistan to go after al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Back home, huge changes happened. The Department of Homeland Security was created, basically overnight, and the controversial Patriot Act was passed, giving the government sweeping news surveillance powers. So the next big step in the war on terror was the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The main reason we were given? That Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. But look at how things played out. The claim was WMDs. The reality was none were ever found. The claim was it would be a quick war. The reality was a long, brutal, and costly insurgency that dragged on for years.
So after almost a decade of war and controversy, the country was just exhausted and ready once again for a really big change. And that change came in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama. It was a decisive victory. And electing the nation's first African-American president, well, it was a truly historic moment that signaled a deep desire to just turn the page and start a brand new chapter. So when you look back from the self-doubt of the 70s to the wars of the 2000s, you see this pattern, right? Each decade is, in so many ways, a direct reaction to the one that came before it. It's this cycle. A crisis happens, and then there's a response. And that cycle has built the America that we know today. So it all leaves us with one last big question. For us, what's the crisis that's defining our time? And what's our response going to be?